Hello. Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I wanted to thank you for joining us today at the 67th United Nations CSW Conference. We are pleased to see many of you, and as we see some other people are joining us, that are representative from different countries. So thank you for your attendance. Please be sure to leave your name, your email address so we can communicate with you, or if any questions you have, you can pose to us. And to keep in touch, of course. Women's Freedom Forum was founded in 1995 after the Beijing International Women's Conference. And it has been 28 years now since its start, and he's been steadfast in making sure that women's rights are respected, and we do our best to do so. And our mission actually supports the UN CSW Strategic Development Goal number 5, which is gender equality and women's empowerment. Women's Freedom Forum is an educational and human rights NGO in a consultative status with UN ECOSOC and is affiliated with the UN Department of Global Communications. WFF strives to raise public awareness of the issues pertaining to women's equality, legal and human rights, political participation, and empowerment. WFF aims to uplift the voices of marginalized women and open their path to mainstream public discourse in order to create greater knowledge and understanding about women's issues and ensure that their voices are heard. Here I want to thank our representative to the United Nations, Lynn Dykstra, with whom unfortunately could not be here today due to some health issues, could not fly. So Lynn, we send our best and quick recovery to you. We also wanted to thank our chair of the WFF, Paula Corrado. Also our advisors and board members, Barbara Forster, David Mattis, Dr. Donna Hughes, Judy Pataskit, Dr. Amina Aldin, and a number of others. Some are here as well. Today, our panelists will speak of concrete examples as to how the effect of digital technology is used to move all of us closer to the success of gender equality and sustainable development goal number 5. It's not easy, but it's attainable. Thank you to UNCSW for the worldwide platform to once again present our stories, share ideas, and opportunities to create solutions for gender equality for women worldwide through giant steps, one at a time. Thank you for joining us this morning, and allow us to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Antonia Felix, who is a writer, educator, and racial equality consultant. She is the New York Times best-selling author of 24 books, several of which are biographies of prominent women leaders. Dr. Felix is an adjunct professor in the School of Education at Minnesota State University, Mankato. Dr. Felix, please join us.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging that the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. Thank you. It's wonderful to see all of you here as this year's UN Women's Session focuses on how digital technology is increasing gender equality and empowering women and girls. Digital tech is almost the largest industry on the planet, second only to finance. So that's really saying something. For example, together, just 5 US companies, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, have a bigger market value than the GDP of Japan. And Japan has the 3rd largest economy in the world. So that gives you an idea of what kind of an impact we're looking at in this digital era. Digital tech is one of the most powerful forces on Earth and impacts everyone, either directly or indirectly. If any sector has the resources to develop the status of women in Iran and the MENA region, it's digital technology. The smartphone, this handheld computer that we probably all own, right? Everyone here have a smartphone, right? Is the way nearly 7 billion people, about 82% of the world, connect and use internet services for daily life. The MENA region isn't far behind that global mark, with 77% of the population using smartphones as of 2021. It's probably more now. Some recent information I got this week from one of my students. One of my students in our university's educational leadership program recently brought to my attention how digital technology is vital to supporting a women's movement in Turkey. My student, who is Kurdish and a native of Turkey, supports the Kurdish women's movement in that country. And she's been sharing with me the important role of mobile technology in her efforts to give her support, particularly now during the earthquake tragedy. Direct mobile support to members of the Kurdish women's movement has been difficult because the government, which has a history of Kurdish oppression, shut down many Kurdish bank accounts of those who support the pro-Kurdish political parties, and I believe there are 2. The Kurdish women's movement focuses on women's equality as the only path toward real democracy and challenges the patriarchal system that subjugates women. It's quite a theory-based movement. Thanks to Western Union, which, as you probably know, now operates through mobile apps, you can do it from your phone, my student has been able to send the money she's collected for this relief to a relative who is active in the women's movement in Turkey. Her relative then sends the funds to organizations she knows are truly using these funds to help the victims of the earthquake. So it's a way to be direct instead of going through the traditional channels, which are not always working. Digital technology also plays a role, she's told me, in communicating about and sharing information about the movement through an online academic platform called the Kurdish Studies Network. Academics from around the world share news about the Kurdish community, including the women's movement. My student is writing her dissertation, as a matter of fact, about this movement and conducting interviews with members via Zoom video technology, which allows her to observe their expressions and other body language that can deepen her understanding of their experiences. As anybody here who's done a little bit of research or read articles knows that in qualitative research we try to get very rich and thick descriptions of our participants. So digital connections like these are an enormous force for good, as we'll hear more about this morning. And we're also all aware of the harms that social media, of course, has wrought through misinformation, the manipulation of our online behavior that can sow division and polarize us, and the way these platforms are abused to bully and harass people. But the digital time we live in, and that defines this century, can connect women with resources and education and opportunities unlike any era we've had in the past. In the MENA region, this means knowing and addressing the reasons women are not using mobile tech yet as much as men. In this region, there's a 17% gender gap in mobile internet use. 23 years ago, the digital gender gap that was leaving women in low and middle income countries behind was put on the international agenda with the launch of Connected Women, a program from the Global System for Mobile Communications Association, GSMA, a trade organization. This group partnered with several countries to increase digital literacy and mobile access to women in these low and middle income countries. Today, the program reports that 60% of women in the MENA region access the internet on mobile phones. Rubina, for example, a woman in Pakistan who learned about mobile money through the program, is the main breadwinner in her family, and she works far away from her small village, about a 6-hour journey, as a domestic worker for a family in Islamabad. She can send money to her family in their farming village and no longer needs to make extra trips home when her husband, who's ill, needs money for medical care. She can just send it through the app. It's an incredibly big quality of life change for her. Closing the gap will mean more women can use money apps to take care of their families, pay bills, take payments for whatever business they're starting up, save money, access credit, make purchases, and in some countries receive government benefits for which they are eligible. Women who are eligible for these public services may not have a formal bank account because they don't have enough money to open one. They cannot pay the fees, or they already have a family member with an account. Mobile money accounts can be the answer to improving women's lives in this way. Buying a smartphone to access mobile money, however, is one of the top 3 barriers responsible for this digital gender gap. These barriers are often listed as, first, affordability and other access issues, illiteracy and or lack of digital skills, and finally, women's safety and security concerns. And I'm going to talk about a couple of these. This brings us to the access problem related to social constraints women face. A lack of family approval is a critical barrier preventing women from getting connected to mobile technology. In regions with conservative social norms, male relatives are the gatekeepers to the internet. Research by GSMA and others found, for example, that family disapproval is a woman's largest barrier to accessing mobile technology in Pakistan. Rubina obviously didn't have this problem, but many women in the region do. It's common for young women, but not young men, particularly in more rural areas, to have their mobile access and use monitored and controlled by their families who want to protect them from harassment and control their communication with men outside the immediate family. In addition to Pakistan, family disapproval ranked near the top of obstacles for women in Algeria and Bangladesh, for instance. One interviewee in a study, a man running a kiosk in Pakistan that sold top-ups, or those prepaid mobile cards for the phone, those credits, said, "Sometimes women do ask to buy internet, but I won't allow it. I tell them, call the network helpline, don't come here." The COVID-19 pandemic has had an effect on this particular social barrier, however. When schooling went online, families with children were pressured to gain access to the internet, and this was considered a socially acceptable use of mobile tech for mothers to use to help their children. This may be a lasting trend we're finding as well. If it is, we can look to this as a positive outcome of the pandemic, for as odd as that sounds. And actually, here in the United States, the pandemic exposed inequities in healthcare access and workplaces that disadvantage people of color to such an extent that these systemic problems are now front and center and being addressed. So that's really a silver lining, too. Women's safety concerns around smartphones are another major factor in the mobile gender gap in low and middle income countries. They fear being mugged when carrying a valuable smartphone, harassed on the street for being a woman and using a phone, and also harassed when trying to buy more phone credits, as I just mentioned in an example. Women want to avoid being threatened and harassed by phone calls from strangers. This happens when their phone numbers are misused by male sales agents when they go to get those phone credits. Suddenly, many men have their number and they receive sexually harassing calls and messages, and if they have a smartphone versus a regular mobile phone, They may deal with social media harassment or bullying and online spyware that stalks them. There are so many reports of this phenomenon. They are afraid they may be exposed to explicit or inappropriate images or videos. Phone carriers and women's advocacy programs tackle this problem by promoting hiring of women in these point of sale shops, in these kiosks, to keep women's numbers safe, and providing skills such as how to download caller ID apps and other safety apps so that they can feel a lot more secure about actually moving into this technology in their daily lives. At home, domestic violence is triggered when their husbands or other male family members are angered by the chance that smartphones are providing inappropriate contact with men and adding an extra expense to the household budget. Contact with men can refer to a woman's photo posted on her mobile money account, for example, or social media. A woman from rural Jordan told a researcher, "I am not even allowed to put my own picture on WhatsApp, as some people can save that image." In rural Pakistan, you do not see women in public in the first place. They are not in the markets shopping for the family, let alone for 60-minute cards or SIM cards for their phones. The idea that images of their faces could be online for the world to see is culture shock. The internet can be a dangerous place for women and girls. In Egypt, young women get arrested for posting videos of themselves on TikTok. Even though they are fully clothed, they are accused of breaching public morals, and they are given prison sentences. Last year, for example, a 17-year-old girl committed suicide after she was blackmailed with digitally altered photos by two young men after she rejected their sexual advances. Also, a 30-year-old teacher whose video was taken while dancing with friends during a river cruise on the Nile ignited a national scandal when someone harmlessly posted the video on social media and it went viral. Some across the country supported her rights, and others blamed her for degrading the country's social values. Her husband divorced her, and the school where she taught fired her. But after so much strong public pushback, she got her job back. Online attacks go with the job for women journalists in the MENA region. This is another very major issue. For example, Faranak Amidi, who grew up in Iran and works for BBC Persia, said, "Bullying in forms of belittling, sexually degrading comments, rape threats, and such are almost daily experience for these women journalists." It is understandable then that women in the MENA region have safety concerns about going online. I hope this brief overview of some of their issues is helpful as you work in all your varied fields to turn the tide in the digital gender gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fredericks. Our next panelist is Dr. Ashraf Zadshir. She's a clinical professor for family medicine, residency program, and an adjunct professor at UCR, and George Washington, and of course, a human rights activist. Dr. Zadshir?
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear? A heartwarming good morning to everybody here and everybody that watch us online. And it was great talk about MENA area region. So I like to start with a story, a real story. Years ago, at a time when there was no cell phone and internet, two of my close friends and I were enthusiastically listened to stories of a young doctor. We used to call her Dr. Mehraban, which means the kind doctor. Her stories always were fascinating, and still her soft voice echoes in my ears. She often carried with her a large old bag filled with medicine and medical supplies. Her stories was about her trips to remote areas where the people didn't have access to healthcare at all. It would take days for them to get to nearest clinic. Dr. Mehrabon was so passionate about helping those people and educating them. Sometimes it took her and her friends days walking through the mountains to reach those areas to help people. I and my two friends were so mesmerized by her that we decided to do the same, become people's doctor. When the time came for us to apply for university, the government announced that it will shut down university for an indefinite period. We joined our siblings and friends who were students at the time and were participating in protests at the Tehran's university. It came to a heavy clash between the students who were inside the university and security forces who stormed forcefully into university. Large numbers of students were injured, many arrested, and unfortunately, few lost their lives. My friend Farzaneh got arrested as well. And after 6 years in prison, she was executed during 1988 massacre. My parents at the time arranged for me to leave Iran to save my life. As I mentioned, all of this happened during the pre-digital era, when media channels such as TV, newspaper, radio, and magazine were all one-way communication and very selective in regards of their reports and influenced by many other factors, as you see today as well. Therefore, the events that I was talking about, including the 1988 massacre, got minimum coverage, if at all. Years passed, and I tried to keep the dream of 3 classmates alive. With all challenges, I became doctor, educator, researcher, and even I was recipient of California Woman of the Year Award for my work in underserved area in South and East Los Angeles. But above all, my real motivation to move on have been always and always be to advocate for women equality and human rights. Now we are in mid-digital area, which has been transformed society in many different ways, even in the way we think and we live. It provides people with access to information and resources that they would not otherwise have. It has helped to connect people from all around the world. To better understand the impact of technology and digitalization on our society, I like to go back to year 2020, as you mentioned. We all remember 2020, the year that was heavily defined by the COVID-19 pandemic that led to global social and economic disruption, worldwide lockdowns, and unfortunately, millions of people lost their lives. Now, in Iran, COVID-19 infections turned to a tragic catastrophe due to mismanagement, cover-up, lack of transparency, lack of enforced isolation, and many, many other factors. Families have suffered additional economic and social harm. Meanwhile, considering the gender discrimination institutionalized by the government, women who were heads of household, and in particular, those women in healthcare were most severely affected. So I saw the necessity to take action to help people in Iran in any way I could. It was a time that advanced technology and digitalization made the connection to people in Iran possible, even with government-imposed sanctions on internet. Using different platforms, I was able to start making educational video clips and sharing them with people. That was the way I started. Also creating protocols for physicians in Iran to use. We offered remote free medical consultation. I was receiving calls and text messages from Iran on a daily basis, even sometimes from other parts of the world. Sometimes I had to direct the cases to my colleagues in different specialties. Over the time, we became a network of specialists with connection to network of colleagues and resident physicians in Iran. We were able to help hundreds of people. I, along other physicians from different parts of the world, organized online medical and educational conferences via Zoom, which were broadcasted in Iran. I shared updated information, instruction, and protocols to our colleagues in Iran via text message, Instagram, and other platforms. I recall one day I got a call from a mother of two who got my phone number from a relative of mine. She had a fever of 103.5. She had productive cough, she had body ache, but she wouldn't go to hospital because there was no relatives around, and she was a single mom. So through my network, we were able to arrange for her to get all the necessary medications, a drop at her door, and also foods drop at her door. We would check on her on daily basis. This case was one of the hundreds of cases that we had. So after 2 weeks, it turned to a happy ending for her and two toddlers. So moving forward to 2022, the COVID-19 pandemic became more under control and started shifting to endemic. But in Iran, the protest sparked on September 16, 2022, by the death of an innocent young woman, Mahsa Amini, at the hands of the so-called mortality police. It turned into massive uprising, spread across Iran in all cities, universities, and high schools. And as you witnessed, young women became the front line of these protests. We soon realized that many Iranians wounded by security forces do not go to hospital for treatment due to fear of being abducted by the intelligence services and plainclothes agents. Women and girls were even more afraid to go to hospital because of arrest and risk of being raped. They would rather take the risk and stay home and appeal to social media or a trusted physician who would help them privately. I and my network of colleagues start getting calls and text messages from wounded protesters asking for help. Because of our experience during COVID, this time we knew that we can help in some extent. Via remote consultation and instruction, we have been able to help many protesters with simple injuries. We started to create educational materials in form of written text and video clips for simple injuries versus serious and life-threatening injuries, and when they should immediately take the risk and go to the hospital. we have been able to keep our connection with our colleagues in Iran who, if needed, would treat patients at home, even knowing the fact that they would putting their own freedom and their lives at risk by helping the protesters. Dr. Aida Rostami was among the trusted doctors. She was a conscientious physician who secretly treated wounded protesters at their homes. On the night of December 12th, 2022, the regime's security services identified and abducted her and killed her under torture. Her family was shocked to see Dr. Aida's body with a smashed face and nose, broken arms, and an enucleated eye. Her body was also bruised in lower part, indicating the scars of a sexual assault. Via social media, these outrageous killings spread not only within Iran, but across the globe, and led to even more intense nationwide protests and international gathering in support of women in Iran. And this is just the beginning of digital era. I know that you said the downside of digital era, but there is also. So here I like to conclude my speech with a quote of Mrs. Mariam Rajavi. Yes, via digital revolution, the world have been able to witness, quote, the magnificent visage of a movement whose fabric is made of the most delicate human emotions, the most selfless battles, and the most genuine desires for freedom, democracy, and equality. Let us be confident that the radiant spring of Iran is imminent, brought about by the unwavering bravery of its women. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Zadshir, for such an impactful speech. Our next panelist is Hannah Toutounchi. She's a brand marketer and innovation strategist, alumni of Northwestern's Integrated Marketing and Communications Graduate Program.
Good morning, everyone. Does this work? My name is Hannah Toutounchi. I'm an Iranian American currently living in Chicago. I work in product innovation and brand marketing, and I'm so humbled to be here with this panel of women to bring my perspective to all of you. I want to thank you for being here and listening to this session. I think now more than ever, it's critical for us to have a dialogue about the state of women in the Middle East and in Iran, which is what I'll be focusing on. Since over the last 6 months, we've witnessed something that history will not forget there. I want to talk to you guys about the power of an image and the power of symbolism and how that can enact global momentum. On September 16th, 2022, a woman named Mahsa Amini died in Iranian police custody after being detained for violating Iran's mandatory headscarf law. Now, I'd like to make something very clear before I go ahead. For thousands of years in Iran, women's clothing and covering was a matter of personal choice. It was never a privilege. Over the past century or so, that's changed, especially over the last 43 years. The Islamic Republic has enforced a mandatory headscarf, and it's become a way for the regime to use violence and repress the women of Iran into second-class citizens. And I'd like to reinforce that wearing of a veil should be a woman's choice and a woman's choice alone. There's nothing wrong with a woman choosing to wear a headscarf. I have many women in my life who choose to wear a headscarf, and that choice is a beautiful thing. Mahsa Amini did not have the privilege of choice in September of last year. And soon after her death, her image and the concept of a mandatory headscarf became the springboard for widespread protests across Iran. Cries to end the mandatory headscarf law reverberated throughout the country and gave way to one of the most powerful examples of a women's-led movement that we've seen in the 21st century. In the wake of these massive protests and the lethal crackdowns by police forces, the mandatory headscarf began to represent the regime's flawed system, and Mahsa Amini began to represent the rest of Iran, who had laid victim to the regime's horrendous crimes over the last 43 years. Now, as someone who works in brand marketing, I know the power of a symbol. It's an image or a concept that badges meaning and value to something big and connects you to it. That's why there's a difference between a bottle of soda and a bottle of Coke, and a computer and an iMac. I also know how the right imagery can create a strong message, a message that's burned into your memory, a message that creates cultural relevance. Mahsa Amini and the mandatory headscarf symbolized decades of repression and catapulted an uprising that, through technology and social media, was broadcasted on the global stage in the form of images and videos. The power of an image. The images and videos of the uprising are powerful, and they tell a clear story. The people of Iran have had enough, and the women of Iran deserve better. After Mahsa Amini's death, countless images flooded the internet from behind closed doors in Iran. Some good, some bad. Let's start with the good. An image of 2 young girls in school outfits walking down the street with their hair down. 5 young women waving their headscarves freely in the air as their fellow brethren cheer them on. An elderly woman on a walker chanting Zan Zindagi Azadi amongst a sea of young people. Iranian artists and intellectuals creating music, art, and poetry in solidarity with protests. A girl dancing in the street to music. Now to the bad. The realization that that same girl who was dancing in the street had been killed, and her body was sent to her parents as a warning. Videos of Iranian security raiding Tehran's top university with lethal force, using automatic weaponry on students and civilians. A policeman dragging a woman by her headscarf down the sidewalk accompanied by his cronies. A woman on the back of a motorcycle with a bag over her head, undoubtedly going to get raped, killed, or both. And most recently, in the last week, a father trying to jump the wall of a girls' school to reach his daughter inside, as authorities carry out a chemical poisoning attack on the children, an event that has gotten minimal coverage by Western news outlets this week. I think when we see these images and videos on social media, it creates a visceral reaction in all of us. What if this was me? What if this was my daughter, my sister, my wife? It's a graphic reminder that the regime in Iran continues to show a cruel disregard for life and doesn't care if anyone sees it. The Washington Post analyzed more than 100 pieces of media, interviewed eyewitnesses, and reviewed information collected by watchdog groups over 17 weeks of protests. They published a report that verifies how security forces, with riot police and plainclothes agents, violently suppressed demonstrations, carrying out unprovoked arrests, random beatings, and opening fire on civilians. They uncovered the level of surveillance the government has over its people, showing agents filming civilians at checkpoints and during protests. This is likely used as evidence against them later on. It's a level of global attention brought to the state of Iran that only the free flowing of information could achieve. The world has now bared witness to the tactics of repression by the Iranian regime through the story that these images tell. Technology has gifted us the clarity and the line of sight to observe a reality that the women of Iran have known all too well for far too long. So much clarity that the international community started to take action. Global protests broke out across 28 countries and 75 cities spanning across 4 continents, all documented on social media in the 2 months following Mahsa Amini's death in September. The UN Commission on the Status of Women removed Iran for the remainder of its 4-year term ending in 2026. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Ms. Thomas Greenfield, stated in a press release on December 14th of last year, "We know she was killed for the crime of being a woman, and for far too long and for far too often, this was not such an unusual thing in Iran." That is global momentum. And that is the power of an image. And we as the global community must not turn away from these images, as they represent the harsh realities that women face as citizens of Iran. We must acknowledge the cause, we must commiserate in the injustice, and we must celebrate the bravery. Today in Iran, women are more empowered than they've been in decades. They are empowered to walk the streets of Tehran wearing whatever they want to wear over their head. They are empowered to demand equal treatment in the matters of divorce, child custody, marriage, and employment. The images that have poured out of Iran onto the internet have forever ruptured the old system of control and communication that those in power in Iran seem to hold close for so long. Technology and shared images have begun to change the course for the status of women in Iran and has enacted global momentum around a cause that at times has felt dormant over the last 43 years. What for years felt like a never-ending struggle in Iran that barely made the global stage finally has a face, a story, and a reason to believe. I think the story of women's plight is nothing new, as we all know. We're all here at this event to learn and to be enablers of change for that very fact. But this year, it was one woman and a mandatory headscarf that branded the women's movement in Iran. And Mahsa Amini in her violation of the mandatory headscarf became the brand emblems of the Iranian uprising, they also gave way to exposing the brutality, celebrating the bravery, and ultimately showing that the government can no longer hide behind the headscarf. To many Iranians, the mandatory headscarf represents the Islamic regime's power. What started as a call to end the mandatory headscarf rules has transcended into something much bigger: the survival of the Islamic Republic. And while the vast majority, around 70% of women in Iran, either do not believe in the forced hijab or are among the improperly veiled, according to a special report by the Iranian parliament themselves, a solution to the mandatory hijab is not enough. The people want regime change. As women went into the streets, burning their headscarves, holding Mahsa Amini's photo on a picket, crying out for equality and retribution, other chants about corruption, about inflation, about why people can't pay their rent anymore, started to sound alongside them. Something bigger bubbled up to the surface. The Washington Post estimates that at least 530 people have been killed and about 19,000 others detained since September, but the number is undoubtedly much higher than this. And now, as we sit here and reflect on the events over the last 6 months in Iran, I think we can all agree that we must act in the people's favor. And we must call on the UN and the international community to demand the immediate abdication of the Iranian government. We must continue to share the images and the videos of the uprising with our networks so we can all access and empathize with someone else's reality. We must continue to amplify their voices and become arbiters for them in our own small but mighty circles. The Iranian women are the ones who started this, but we can all play a part in ending it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. These are the photos that you see on the two sides are the photos of the ones that Hannah was referring to, that were the protesters and those who opposed the Iranian regime. Our next speaker is Mandy Sangera. She's an award-winning philanthropist and a global campaigner, as well as being an international motivational speaker with 3 decades of experience. Mandy is an expert in developmental related fields. She's been driving innovation building strategies, partnerships, promoting human rights, gender equality, accountability, and social justice globally. Mandy?
Thank you, everybody, first of all. It's great to see so many people here. And there's so many people in the room, and actually we can all do our bit by tweeting and using the hashtags and actually raising awareness of Women Freedom Forum. They are on social media, so everybody please feel free to tweet and share the messages and things that you hear, because it is really important, because we can all do our little bit, and people sometimes don't realize the power of social media. I have worked all over the world, and especially within the MENA region, and I have been campaigning on women's rights, and I'm a founder of the UK Forced Marriage Unit. I have worked with governments across the MENA region, and actually, as I've heard from so many of my colleagues talk about the current events in Iran, and we have seen the power of social media. We have seen how we can raise awareness of the campaigns and try to see the videos that have been coming out. But I also want us to reflect on this. Just as we are getting smarter at using technology, so is the Iranian government and all governments around the world. And there is censorship. You can live in certain parts of the world and actually can't access certain parts of the internet. We've seen young people being groomed and being exploited online. Just as the internet is great to surf and do things, sadly people will befriend people, groom children online, and children have been victims of paedophilia. We have seen children being sexually exploited. We've seen people playing games and their parents think, oh great, my child's out of the room now and I can get on and watch telly, or I can do some cooking, cleaning, or whatever they want to do, and actually do not know what their children are doing. I'm from the UK, my accent's probably given that away, but I want to sort of say something though. When the pandemic hit, I was really shocked. The UK, a G7 country, one of the richest countries in the world, has people from working class backgrounds who couldn't access the internet. The pandemic really brought home the truth around the haves and the have-nots. We saw children not having access to the internet or even a computer to access, their homework. And so what I did, I went to colleagues and some of the big companies that I was working with, because all of us had to work from home around the world. And I actually made people think about their corporate social responsibility and clean up the hard drives, clean up their old computers. How many of us change our phones every time there's a new one? Most of us kind of change our technology and the first one is working. So why not clean it up? Why not send it and pay it forward and give it to somebody else to access and level up that playing field? And actually through the pandemic, I was doing work in the global south and I saw young women, and like Antonio said, brothers and fathers are censoring the internet. They're worried about their daughters talking to somebody, their daughters having a boyfriend or being on social media, putting out a picture. Sadly, the family honor overrides everything for so many of us. Even though there has been amazing advancements within technology and we're seeing AI, we're seeing all of that, there is also unconscious biases and there is a lot of things that still need to be improved. But I think that we have come a long way in the last 3 decades. Things have really improved and it has given us access to connect with people like never before. We're able to develop our social networks and our global friendships around the world and work with people and raise awareness. As we've seen the death of Mahsa Amini in Iran, and we have seen that, it's built up momentum. But I'm actually sort of saying to people, we need to continue to keep that momentum up. Because actually, as we've seen the Me Too movement, before we've seen the Black Lives movement, we don't want it to just be a storm in a teacup. We really need to keep up that momentum. So it comes back to my point about sharing the messages. When you hear messages and you hear comments, put them out there, tweet them, share them, put them on LinkedIn, whatever social media platforms that you are using. I've also been involved in evacuating Afghans during the last 18 months, and to date we have evacuated 395 Afghans, and I'm very proud of the work that I have done with some of my fellow campaigners from around the world, Tatiana, Phyllis, a few to name. And we had to work together with governments. And one of the things that was really shocking was all the amount of messages that I was getting every single day for cries for help. People telling me today that they don't have access to food. Many people jumped over the border to Iran to seek safety. And actually, it's become even worse for them. They can't even come back. And actually, so many of these women are being forced into prostitution. So one minute we're seeing a country that is very conservative and talking about, covering your head. And that is fine, because actually I belong, to a faith Sikhism, and if women want to cover their head, they're allowed to. If Catholic women want to cover their head, and if Muslim women or Jewish women want to cover their head, they have that right. And this is what this campaign is about. It is about choice. It's not about just oppressing you and telling you that you have to cover your head. So I think that, I respect if you want to cover your head, you have that right. But it should not be forced on you. And we need to raise our voice and become together to raise that. I also do a lot of work within the MENA region, like with the UAE, Qatar and Bahrain and other countries, and work with women and grassroots organizations. And I had a very interesting conversation. And I said to them, what are your thoughts about the Iran movement right now around the head covering? And a lot of those women are very proud of, their culture, and they want to cover their head. But they said there are some young people who don't want to cover their head, and they don't have to. But they said the difference in Iran is that because our Maslow hierarchy of needs, warmth, food, shelter, is being met. Even if we're living in a country where it's been run by a family in Saudi Arabia or whatever it is, but actually we have access to healthcare, education, we have healthcare to housing, we have our basic needs met. Sadly, in Iran, as much as the government is getting rich, sadly, people are getting poorer. And that is one of the real differences. And actually, if we want regime change, as I keep saying to people, we need to unite. Because at the moment, everyone's kind of pulling in different directions, and there doesn't seem to be many leaders. Everyone's fighting for that seat at that table. But actually, if you want change, then you need to unite. When Shah was in power, people were very unhappy at times, and they were unsettled. But actually, the Ayatollah at the time came with charisma, charm, and came with a movement, with a message to people. And people brought into that. And he was able to do that. So one of the things that I will say, that, we live around the world, and actually some of us, are very lucky that we have freedoms of expression. We have our basic human rights being met. But I also want to say that actually my digital footprint should be my human right. It should be that actually I should be allowed to put things out. It should not be censored. And sometimes people may not like what I have to say, but it's about free speech. It is about keeping up that momentum and being able to use social media for good. It's when we are censored and we're only allowed to put out certain messages, and then the big companies actually decide they don't like what I've put out or somebody's not put out. They want to block you on social media, or they remove all your content. So I think that we need to just sort of be careful about what we are putting out there. How do we use social media for good? And we have seen women being exploited. As much as the tech has moved, and it's been fantastic, I have supported women who have been victims of grooming on dating sites, who are sitting at home, who may be divorced or widowed and looking for new friendships and new relationships, end up falling victims and thinking this gentleman really wants to be my next husband and loves me, and actually end up sending inappropriate pictures, not realizing what it is that is what you're putting out there is going somewhere, and people will keep it on a smartphone. And it is about, governments taking responsibility, because actually, as much as it is great to be able to have access to the internet and put our messages out there, there is a dark side to that, around the grooming and being exploited. People been told, look, we want funding because we got this campaign, there's somebody starving in Afghanistan, in Iran, can you send us money? And sadly, people fall victims. Somebody will tell you got a long lost relative, then you've inherited £100 million, and please be careful, because actually people don't realize the dangers. And actually what I would always say, if it looks too good to be true, it often is too good to be true. So it is really important that we think about what we're putting out there. And if you don't want it out there, then you shouldn't be doing that. Because one of the things it's about on the street. Would you really just go out and say, hi, I'm Mandy, this is my national insurance number, this is where I live, and this is how much money I've got in my bank account? Really? And so I would say to you, why would you then put that out online? Because actually, if you would not do it in person, why would you do that online? And it is kind of like making us think about that. But I do want us to think about, how do we support women? And, for the next 2 weeks at the UN, there is going to be so many conversations around leveling up, around digital, looking around women's safety, looking about how do we promote equality, how do we level up that? And I'm going to say to you, please go around and join and attend as many conferences as you can. And if there are things that you're interested in, then please network and connect with people. Connect with people on social media and use it for good and build that momentum. And I will ask you to use the hashtag, for Iran, which is about freedom and everything else that they're asking for. And if you want to get behind people, then we need to do that. We have seen places like Turkey right now being able to share pictures and images and showing you like what's happening. But it's got to be more than that. We have to have the substance, and we've got to be able to really engage and share those messages. And I want to also say, before I kind of wrap up, because I know that other panelists want to be on as well, and it would be good to take a few questions at the end, that it's so important that we think about like other people in other countries that don't have the freedom, in places where China and India and other countries, sometimes people have access to the internet, but actually some sites have been blocked. So, it is about that censorship. And in Iran, we have seen things where people have taken down some websites, and young people can't post their pictures and videos, but they are getting out of there. There is sadly the dark web as well, which actually, people end up falling victim to and being exploited. So it is about us being just a conscious leader, looking at what else we can put out there. How do we stay safe online? How do we keep our children safe online? Because actually, we need to know what our children are doing. We need to know who the hell they're talking to. When somebody's saying, oh, hi, I'm Matthew from America, I'm 9, he may not be. He might be like a 50-year-old man. So, and we have seen that. And we have seen children being victims of trafficking and being exploited, children going out to meet somebody. We've seen young people being groomed online in the UK before, when, we've had crises and they've been victims of being exploited and joining terrorist organizations. So, we really do need to think about the safety. As much as the internet is great and it's really fantastic, think about your own data, think about what you want to put out there, and take a bit more responsibility and ownership for your own data. Because like I said, you don't want to be sharing your national insurance number, your bank details, unless somebody's putting money into it, of course, but you know what, they're not really going to do that. So thank you again, guys, and we'll take some questions later on.
Thank you so much, Mandy. Our next panelist speaker is Zahra Amanpour. She's the founder of Main Street Assembly and senior advisor at Jobs for the Future. She has worked in economic development with a focus on women's entrepreneurship for the past 2 decades. She believes that entrepreneurship is a tool for economic justice, and she's also an entrepreneur and a mother herself. Zahra, please join us.
Hi, everyone. Let me try to get this mic so they don't have to adjust me 3 times. Am I good? I'm honored to be here with all of you today during this amazing month where we celebrate women all around the world and come together and figure out how we can make it better for all women around the world. I'm also honored to be in the presence of this panel today and the incredible work that they are doing every day, the hard work that we all need to be doing every day to level this playing field and to make sure that women around the world have the same access that we do. And I'm especially honored to be standing in front of this photo behind me today that includes such brave souls. And if you look at their faces, some of them are the age of my daughter. And some of them are, they're just beautiful souls standing behind me today. And I just hope that we remember these pictures, and as Hannah was sharing, the power of the image, and share as much as we can during this time and during these conversations. Today, I'm going to be speaking about the common threads of digital access when it comes to economic inclusion and advancement for women, both in the United States and in Iran. I'm an Iranian American, so these worlds have always collided and come together for me, and so I speak from that perspective. Over the past several decades, we have seen technology play a pivotal role in increased access and inclusion for marginalized groups, particularly women. Digital access has opened doors for women and lowered the barriers to economic inclusion and advancement for them. Women around the world have gained access to knowledge, jobs, social capital, and opportunities that were unattainable to them not that long ago for many reasons, including logistical, financial, and cultural. More women are starting businesses than ever before, fueled by digital access. Globally, 1 in 3 businesses is owned by a woman. Many NGOs, nonprofits, and other entities have made closing the digital gap a priority in order to more fully actualize this potential and bring more opportunities to women, as indicated by the priority theme of this CSW 67 session. While great progress has been made, digital access is still far from equitable, particularly in countries with restrictive laws on women like Iran. We must learn from the avenues that have been pursued and momentum that has been built and continue to break the chains, ceilings, and attitudes that prevent women from fully participating in the economy. We must fight to bring attention to the oppressive cultural norms and restrictive laws that are preventing women from attaining economic independence and self-sufficiency. My talk today will attempt to tackle one small piece of this enormous spectrum of work, the progress that has been made and the many challenges we still face by focusing on the impact of digital access on women in recent years in the United States within the realm of entrepreneurship and business ownership, specifically from the lens of access to education, social capital, and financial capital. I will then outline some of the practices and laws currently being enforced on women in Iran that prevent them from pursuing entrepreneurship and gaining economic independence, despite very high education rates and digital know-how, and also share the reasons for optimism and hope. Women entrepreneurship is growing at a fast pace in the United States. 49% of new businesses in 2022 were started by women, compared to 28% in 2019. Women of color are starting 4 times the number of businesses than before the pandemic. These growth rates were accelerated by the pandemic with the rapid transition of commerce and resources to online platforms. As schools closed down and family support structures further deteriorated, women sought more flexible work that allowed them to be present in the home and still earn income. Historically, women in the United States lag behind men in terms of business growth rates, both in terms of revenue and number of employees. The main reasons for this is limited access to social and financial capital relative to men. Women are less likely to be invited into social networks that would allow them the connections and resources needed to more significantly grow a business, and have been traditionally controlled and shared amongst men. Furthermore, women are less likely to get a loan as a startup, even though their default rates are significantly lower than men, and less likely to secure investment financing for their business. Women only receive 7% of venture funding in the United States. There are still many barriers to entrepreneurship and business ownership for women in the United States. From a cultural lens, women are taught that high-risk career aspirations are reckless and wasteful. Women have rejected these notions and responded by creating networks and entrepreneurial support structures of their own that better cater to the needs and realities women face. Additionally, the shift towards online networking groups, incubators, and funding platforms have made it possible for women to connect with other women that serve as mentors, investors, and advisors with fewer geographical and logistical constraints. One example of how these types of direct connections can be powerful is that women have a 70% success rate with crowdfunding, compared to 29% for men. Successful entrepreneurship and business ownership do not require formal education. In fact, the lack of required education and credentials is one of the main reasons why it appeals in more marginalized populations and is seen as a means to economic inclusion and advancement by those looking to create more opportunities for women. However, the chance of success, specifically a higher growth rate, does increase with training and knowledge related to more formal business practices and personal initiative. The pandemic propelled availability of resources, training, and education online benefited women greatly. Women are more likely to seek knowledge and resources to help them overcome challenges compared to men. The growth of online and affordable entrepreneurial training programs and business courses has allowed them the opportunity to pursue educational opportunities and further advance their businesses. The increased digital access to education, social capital, and financial capital has made the United States an even friendlier environment for women to start businesses. It remains to be seen whether or not these more flexible and accessible digital options will have the longer-term impact of women generating the same revenues and employing the same number of people and giving them the same self-sufficiency, freedom, and influence that men have in the economy through entrepreneurship. The full potential of this more fluid digital realm has yet to be tested. We have seen a similar trend around the world for women entrepreneurs, both in developing and developed countries. Regardless of the size of the economy, we see that the more access women are given to education, social capital, and financial capital, the more likely they are to start successful businesses and push the momentum towards greater economic inclusion and advancement. We also see that digital access increases the likelihood of this happening and presents many benefits that have yet to be fully explored. Of course, the realities and challenges are more difficult for women in developing countries, but the variables remain the same. As long as certain rights and personal freedoms exist for women and larger conditions surrounding access to information are relatively open. However, there are circumstances that digital access cannot transcend for women. Countries that limit the extent to which women can access and leverage resources through laws, censorship, and oppressive social orders deliberately remove women from the realm of entrepreneurship and potential economic benefits. These types of practices are at the core of Islamic fundamentalism. In my homeland, Iran, restrictive social norms encouraged and enforced by the clerical regime prevent women from pursuing the same work and business opportunities as men. Women are dissuaded from anything that really requires them to have a public identity and gives them economic independence, and kept out of influential social networks that can lead to opportunities. Furthermore, restrictive inheritance and property laws make it less likely for women to be able to leverage existing assets and other financing mechanisms. Traditional financing mechanisms like banks and investment funds are highly biased and not likely to extend capital to women. Women are excluded from anything that can potentially bring them the social and financial capital needed to start a business and lead to economic independence and advancement. Despite the many challenges, 85.5% of women in Iran are literate, and more women pursue higher education degrees than men. Women seek out education as a means of access and inclusion in society. While education does create some avenues for economic advancement for women, it is limited without the needed social and financial capital. The censorship of the internet and information flow by the regime also make it less possible for women to pursue alternatives and gain the same benefits from digital access as their counterparts in the US and around the world. Furthermore, the overall restrictive environment stagnates the innovative, creative, and more fluid conditions needed for entrepreneurial advancement, particularly for women, who are globally more dependent on non-traditional avenues to pursue social and financial capital. These types of contradictions and restrictions around economic access and inclusion are exactly why women are leading the revolution in Iran today. Entrepreneurship is only one small example of how the many misogynistic, repressive elements of society that have been holding women back through two dictatorships, the previous monarchy and the current religious dictatorship, are also what is placing them at the front lines of the fight for freedom. Women in Iran fully understand that their oppression is not just in the more glaring, repressive elements of the dictatorship they live under, like obligatory hijab, but also in the intricacies and complexities of the everyday pursuit of opportunity. Iranian women have revolted against both the more covert aggressions against women under the previous regime that kept women tucked away in subservient roles with no economic independence or means of self-sufficiency, and the more overt aggressions against women under the current regime that openly declare women as less valuable and incapable of making any decisions of real consequence. This is why it is critical for the Western world to not settle for reform or antiquated and simplistic alternative governments as the answer for freedom for the people of Iran. The people of Iran need real change that will address the intricacies and complexities of what is necessary for women to fully participate in society and the economy. Economic access and advancement must be viewed as one of the cornerstones of their freedom, and unrestricted digital access as one key element of it. Ms. Mariam Rajavi, the president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, acknowledges this in her 10-point plan for the future of Iran. She clearly articulates the necessary rights women must have for equality in the economic sphere, including equal rights to inheritance, entering contracts, and property management. She specifically calls for, quote, justice and equal opportunities in the realms of employment and entrepreneurship for all of the people of Iran in a free market economy, end quote. These types of bold acknowledgments are why the monarchs and regimes that have ruled Iran for generations are so adamant in undermining the role of women in the resistance and the potential for a truly equal society led by women in all realms of society.
Mitra, please join us.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And these critical moments that Iranians are impressing the entire world with their incredible bravery and calling their revolution a women revolution, it's an honor to be with you on celebrating the International Women's Day. The role of digital media in Iran in the past few months have certainly been important, especially to the youth who are organizing the protests, from sharing calls to strikes and posting posters calling for protests in various cities. Social media, especially Twitter, has been a way for the people of Iran to communicate with each other. The millions hashtags of Mahsa Amini and many others have been brought international attention to the Iranian people's plight and put a spotlight on the regime's brutality. Other social media platforms allow ordinary Iranians to post videos and reveal the cruelty against the protesters. From beatings to directly firing upon innocents in the street who are peacefully protesting and attacks in dormitories, videos have come out allowing the international community to know the truth. In a country with no free media and ranked as one of the worst places for press freedoms, this is incredibly important. As a former political prisoner during the 80s, it was different to reach the international community to expose gross human rights violation with various tortures and executions that took place. Unfortunately, this was one of the reasons, as Dr. Zadshir mentioned, that the 1988 massacre of thousands of political prisoners stayed a secret for many years and still, to this day, is being hidden by the Iranian government. Today, social media accounts share information about political prisoners and expose prison officials and the list of the interrogators that torture innocent prisoners. This information allows the world to properly investigate the perpetrators of such crimes, as we see in the UN fact-finding mission. An important part of why the UN fact-finding mission will be full of evidence is due to social media. They have posted instructions on how to send evidence of crimes by government institutions on their Twitter and other platforms in Farsi. Iranians inside the country can see this and send information without risking direct communications with UN investigators, which will surely be punished severely by the authorities in Iran. During the unrest, internet usage has also been shut down countrywide to limit the organizations of these protests. The Iranian government always blocking popular social networks like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and more. Iranians use social media despite government restrictions, although many bloggers, online activists, and technical staff have faced prison sentences, torture, harassment, and abuse. In the last months, 2 popular applications, WhatsApp and Instagram, were blocked and on and off in Iran due to the uprising. One example is when notorious Evin prison in Tehran was set on fire by the Iranian regime. Evin is the most notorious prison in Iran, built in 1972 by the previous dictator, who used it for holding political prisoners. Evin became a symbol of savagery on one hand and a symbol of resistance by those seeking freedom on the other. On October 15, 2022, the videos recorded by people who live near Evin prison showed a fire, multiple explosions, and continuous gunfire inside that prison. Those videos quickly went viral on social media. Many concerned families and protesters gathered near the prison, chanting slogans and clashing with the security forces. 40 prisoners were killed during that attack, and more than 60 were injured. Had the people of Tehran not rushed towards Evin prison on that Saturday night, many more prisoners would have been killed by the IRGC forces. In an hour and a half, #Evin prison was a trend, and major media outlets reported that horrifying news, so the Iranian regime realized that they had to put out the fire. That was the power of social media that saved so many lives at that night. Now I would like to share my story about Evin prison. I was a teenager when I was snatched and arrested in 1981, basically for being outspoken about women's rights violations in Iran, and spent 4 hellish years in notorious Evin prison. I experienced horrible psychological and physical tortures during those years. I remind you that when religious extremists took control in Iran, the oppression of women and girls were the first to be adopted. In the early 1980s, Khomeini could not consolidate his absolute rule without genocide, so thousands were arrested every single day. And all the prisons, especially Evin prison, were full of people, and I mean beyond their capacity, with most of them were high school and university students. Hundreds were executed every night inside prisons in Tehran and other cities. I remember the sounds of coup de grace that was administered every single night, and some nights we could count up to 200, and that continued for several months. The regime made a point of publishing long lists of names of executed every single day in the newspapers. I was so scared and shocked by what I was witnessing. Tortures began immediately. The harrowing sounds of screams and floggings were nonstop. Cruelty and torture had no limits, like flogging, electrocution, hanging by wrist while being beaten up, and rape. Hence many, especially the young teenagers, mentally as well as physically, could not take it and lost their sanity or committed suicide. I lost so many friends of mine and the cellmates. Mothers with newborn infants to 7-year-old grandmothers, pregnant women to teenagers were all around me in Evin prison. I had asked myself why these guards were so cruel and violent against women. This came from their ideology that considered women as second-class citizens. To them, actually, we didn't have a right to even, being born as a woman. And being born as a woman and being outspoken, it's one of the greatest sins. So you're a woman, and you're an outspoken woman, and you fight for your basic rights. So that's the greatest sin of all. Unfortunately, medieval misogyny continues in prisons and in public to this day, with the same perpetrators still in power. You should all know that the Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi, was one of the members of the Death Commission in the summer of 1988, when more than 30,000 political prisoners were massacred. Beginning in July of 1988, thousands of political dissidents held in prison across Iran were forcibly disappeared suddenly. They were mostly young men and women, some just teenagers, unjustly imprisoned because of their political opinions and non-violent political activities. Prisons across the country were put on lockdown, and the authorities suspended family visits without giving any reasons. For months, nothing was heard. Gradually, terrifying rumors began to circulate about mass secret executions and the dumping of bodies in unmarked mass graves. Families' worst fears were confirmed from late October of 1988, when prison visits resumed and authorities informed many families that their loved ones have been executed. However, over the last 34 years, the authorities have cruelly denied them not only a body to mourn over, but also the truth about when, how, and why their loved ones were killed, what happened to them in their last moments, and where their remains are buried. In October 2018, Amnesty International sent the Iranian authorities a summary of its findings and requested related information and clarification, but has so far received no response. There is no doubt that during several months, thousands of political dissidents were systematically subjected to enforced disappearance in Iranian detention facilities across the country. Many of those killed were subjected to torture and other cruel treatment or punishment in that process. In December of 2019, top human rights experts of the United Nations finally described the massacre of political prisoners in Iran as crime against humanity, and after the Second World War, the greatest crime of the century. One of my cousins was executed at that time. He was in prison for 7 years and was supposed to get released the following year. But the Iranian regime just executed him without even informing my family. And up to this day, we don't even know where his burial site is. Amnesty International released multiple reports on how female prisoners are subjected to harshest tortures and confinement. These harsh treatments are to break their resistance and to punish them for rising. This is what you still see on the streets of Iran every single day. There are some very concerning reports and video footages coming from Iran regarding the wave of intentional poisoning of female students, which started in November in the religious city of Qom, spread further throughout the country, and reached schools in small towns and villages. This deliberate poisoning of female students is a government project to take revenge on the students for participating in the nationwide uprising after the death in custody of Mahsa Amini. Parents and locals in different cities were seen protesting and chanting anti-regime slogans in response to attacks on their children. In some areas, regime security forces were seen brutally attacking the concerned parents and arresting them. Now, as we all know, for a century, Iranian women have been on the forefront of this fight against dictatorship, and their uttermost determination is freedom and equality. one thing is for sure. Despite all these atrocities, there is an organized resistance movement, and more than 50% of its leadership are women. In Iran, many young women have organized resistance units. They won't give up, and they won't give in. They are determined to bring about change, and we are hoping for that bright future soon. Thank you.
Every time I hear you, you make me cry. And we need to know that there are children young as 6 and 7 in prison today in Iran, and we need to use our voice. And if you're in here and if you've been moved by that, and if you haven't, you're in the wrong room, we need to keep putting that pressure up, because we need UNICEF and other organizations to take the lead, because actually we cannot allow this to continue. You know, what
Yes.
happened in 88 is happening today.
Exactly. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Mishra, for your moving, you're an inspiration. And you've done justice and right by the voices that were silenced and are being silenced, yet amplifying the voices of the ones fighting for their basic human rights of being a human. So thank you so very much. Unfortunately, we are kind of run out of time for a Q&A session. As you can tell, we have to vacate the room rather immediately. But I wanted to say happy International Women's Day. More power to you. Thank you for attending. And please follow us on our social media. You have the information. And hopefully, if you have any questions, any comments, you're welcome to submit it to us through social media. We will be glad, or through emails. We will answer that. Thank you so very much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for attending and your insights. Have a wonderful day and happy International Women's Day. Thank you.